I'm here with Samantha Nutt, who's written Damned Nations, which is a critique of our aid regimes. And so I wanted to start off by asking you about the efforts of universities to promote Go Global programs, to create global citizens, that our next generation of future leaders needs to be exposed to the world's problems. How can we create these global citizens without that exposure?
Some groups approach it by doing very short-term missions, maybe 1 week or 2 weeks, that are often run by for-profit companies where young people get on a plane and go overseas and engage in some kind of work, whether it's caring for orphans or helping to rebuild a school, and then they come home. And that's the extent of that educational experience. And there are some real problems with that, both in terms of the sustainability of those programs, in terms of the expertise of people who are being sent overseas, whether it is safe and appropriate for local children and local young people who might also be exposed to this constant revolving door of internationals arriving. You know, that's a huge question as well. But there are ways that you can go about it and do it properly. And for young people especially who are really interested in international health and international development, for example, you know, Engineers Without Borders is a fantastic Canadian organization that doesn't just make it possible for students to go overseas, but it does it in the context of an ongoing leadership and development education program. And then those particular placements are actually longer than 2 weeks. They last several months. And they're done in an appropriate and a sustainable fashion. And people who are participating in those initiatives go with the full understanding and the knowledge and the skills that they need to make a useful contribution. Groups like Canada World Youth, they're volunteer service overseas. There are a number of different groups who understand that it's really important for young people to get the experience and get the job training, but they do it in the right way, and they do it in a way that's based on information and a strong commitment to development principles, and that's what I'm in favor of.
Now, you're very critical of what some people call poverty porn. In your opinion, is it better that schools and health centers not be built at all than be built through money raised through poverty porn?
Well, I think we create some false dichotomies here. We assume that the only effective way to raise money is to appeal to the lowest common denominator, to show these wretched images of people who are living with war and violence around the world, and that we will be moved to action through guilt. But I think that there are other ways that we can be moved to action. We can also be moved to action through information and through discussion and dialogue. And so I don't see it as an either or. I see it as, how is it that we want to be progressive in terms of development? How do we want to portray people who are living in other parts of the world who are experiencing tremendous hardship and tremendous obstacles? And what message do we want to send? And fundamentally to me, the message that we want to send, the information that we want to convey, is one of partnership, it's one of respect, it's one that's rooted in local capacity building, and in the recognition that it is people within these countries who have the skills and the competencies and the courage to be their own architects of change, and that is what good development actually means. Otherwise, we run the risk, and I think we have seen this, of developing compassion fatigue. And we're so immune to these repetitive images of people in other parts of the world suffering that we are reluctant to act.
I see. So I'm going to take a quote from your book. You write, with every school that is built by well-meaning Western volunteers in impoverished villages in Africa, there is one less opportunity to provide employment and skills training to young people living in these communities. So there may be short-term losses from this kind of building schools, but aren't the long-term gains of education worth it?
Well, education is always critically important, and we know that by investing in education, especially girls' education around the world, and boys' education as well, that it has a tremendous impact on people's health and well-being over the long term. So I see that as critically important. But again, it comes down to what is the best mechanism? And the best mechanism is always to work with and through local partners, to provide them with the resources, to listen to them, to allow them to drive that process. And so really it comes down to, do we want to continue to support more imperialistic models where we send over that foreign expertise, we take over that labor, without asking the hard questions of, well, how are these schools going to be maintained? Who is going to pay for the teachers? What is the level of receptivity of that community? Is this something that they themselves are invested in? When we don't ask those questions, we actually dampen the impact of those development initiatives, and then it becomes money that isn't well spent. So it really, to me, is a question of what is the most effective kind of aid, and how can we support that? And we cannot be doing that at the expense of people who are on the ground, who also want and deserve those opportunities.
Now, you argue that private philanthropy cannot substitute for government ODA because of special interests. To what extent is government aid also subject to special interests?
Well, I write about this in Damnations, and government aid is absolutely subject to special interests, especially to political ideology. And we've certainly have seen this, whether you look at the difference between how and what the U.S. government is funding under Bush versus Obama, under Chrétien versus Harper. You know, obviously our own ideological baggage figures into this kind of decision making. The real issue, though, is that when you have a consolidation of aid money around private philanthropy, then it becomes even more vulnerable to those special interests, because then you really are talking about either a corporate point of view or an individual, wealthy individual's point of view, which then ends up driving the priority decision making, which shapes that kind of policy. And sometimes the outcome of that can be very good. I mean, you look at the work of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, that has really shone an important spotlight on neglected diseases and on AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria, and coming up with new and pioneering ways of addressing some of these health challenges. At the same time, you can have fiercely ideological groups that then put forward a completely different agenda, which you know, frankly can be quite dangerous.
Should we welcome the efforts of corporations that donate money for their bottom line and not to save the meek?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that corporations who are making charitable contributions and who are not imposing a particular agenda on organizations, I think that they you know, they want to do what we all want to do, which is to give back and to have a positive impact and to be good global citizens. And I think that that's very, very commendable. What tends to blur those lines, though, in my experience, is the donation of hard goods. Because hard goods are often a very, unless you're talking about, for example, pharmaceutical supplies, if you're talking about T-shirts and flip-flops and other sort of surplus goods, the economic impact of that on local economies and local trades can be quite significant. And so that's where I really draw the line in terms of making sure that any donation, corporate or private, that we are asking the right questions of ourselves to ensure that it is that particular contribution is timely, relevant, necessary, and effective.
For sure. Now I want to talk about the media and the role in the aid process. And specifically, we need the media to be in situations of humanitarian disaster in order to spread the message. That's how people are convinced to give money to relief efforts. And yet sometimes they interfere with those relief efforts, as you make clear in your book. So how do we reconcile those two prerogatives?
Well, in the context of any emergency, humanitarian emergency, both the media response and the NGO response can become an absolute circus. And we saw this in Haiti, we saw it during the tsunami, we have seen it elsewhere. And so we need to be mindful of that. You know, for me, it's always about asking, what is the measure of my impact? Am I doing the right thing? And how can I do that better? And I think when you're talking about the impact of the media, in fact, I think one of my greatest frustrations is always that there is a crisis and there's this rush to cover it. And that tends to result in this massive outpouring of support. But there often isn't the education that goes along with that kind of media intervention, where we're really asking, well, what is useful in this situation? And where will we be a year from now? And how can we, again, address some of these broader challenges, whether those are challenges around democratic development, around education, around income. You know, these are some of the bigger issues. And so I guess my criticism of the media is not that they cover these crises. It's more that in many cases these crises are covered in a very superficial way without any ongoing follow-up. And we unfortunately then end up turning a blind eye to some other pressing global challenges. For example, the conflict in eastern Congo, the ongoing conflict in Darfur and in South Sudan. These tend to be overshadowed by the ambulance chasing, and I think that's a great tragedy, because I think that there is room for that kind of dialogue within our media as well.
So I want to end our conversation by bringing it home to Canada. And specifically, since the Harper government came to power, they've committed themselves to A, focusing their efforts on donating aid to countries as opposed to NGOs, and B, towards focusing their efforts towards a handful of countries as opposed to 100 different countries. A, are these the right moves for the Canadian government? And B, have they been effective?
Well, I think that the defining approach of the current government has been to focus our aid spending on to tie it to defense and to trade interests. So, you know, a significant amount of our money has either been skewed towards geographical trade priorities, or it's been focusing on the countries in which Canada is militarily engaged. And I see some major challenges with that approach. And I guess fundamentally for me it comes down to, what is the purpose of aid? What is the original vision of aid? I firmly believe that the purpose of aid should be to focus on those who are most vulnerable, who are living with violence and extreme poverty, and who are facing other threats because of, for example, either natural or human-made disasters. We're even seeing this in the context of climate change around the world, and increasing drought and displacement and starvation. So, you know, I firmly believe that aid should focus on those high-need, high-priority groups. The problem then is that when most of our aid is bilateral or is tied to trade, many of those high-need groups are being excluded because either the trade interests don't exist, or because when we're focusing again on our aid through bilateral assistance, the governments within those countries are either corrupt or undemocratic, or there just isn't that kind of transparency that we would really need. So I do take issue with that, and I do think that ultimately what you want from any aid program is balance, that balance between needs and opportunities. And for me, I think that that's where NGOs really do help to bridge that gap, and where funding of NGOs needs to continue and to be sustained.
Okay, well, thanks so much for chatting with me. That was great.
Thank you.